So this is a GUAC maintainer meeting, happens weekly on Mondays. As usual, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted online. Participation in the meeting is in accordance with LF antitrust as well as OpenSSF code of conduct policies. All right, looks like we have a couple agenda items to get through. One is from follow-up from governance changes from last week, and then you had a topic about community meetings, which I think you were looking at. I think, is there anything else that any folks wanted to add to the agenda? Anything top of mind? All right. If not, let's get started with the first one. I'll share my screen. Hold on. Share screen. Cool. So I tried to encapsulate some of the changes that we talked about within the document for the evolution of the GUAC community. I think there are two major changes within this PR I've created. The first one is totally irrelevant um, to what we talked about, which is we used to have this technical advisory members group. It seems like we're not really using it, and so my suggestion here was to, while we are doing this like reviewing our governance, to deprecate that. So I think that's something that wanted to get everyone's feedback on. And then the main aspects of it, I'm gonna just show this version. So the main aspects of this is now changing the governance on MD to kind of talk a little bit about the GUAC community. So like saying the GUAC community is like the OpenSSF meetings, the website, the GitHub organization administration, right? So we have like the GUAC community and then the GUAC community, the GUAC core projects, right? So I think trying to figure out a way that we can distinguish like the projects versus like the meetings and all those things, the GitHub organization, and that's the terminology I came up with. I'm not married to it, so if any other folks have a better way to kind of distinguish the two, I'd be happy. Ben.
I don't know if I have a better word in mind yet, but just to make sure I understand. So you're basically saying what you're calling the GUAC community here is like the top level governance, and then the two core projects roll up to that. Is that
Yes.
okay?
Yes. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, to me
and
also
yeah,
this sounds good. Go ahead.
sorry.
I
Sorry, what
just
did you
wanted to say, yeah, it sounds good to me. Like it's clear.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, so idea is that the core projects, oh, I need to change the typo, encapsulate larger bodies of work where separate governance of code and process makes sense. But at the same time, we want to retain requirements around licensing and code of conduct. So it's split into GUAC community maintainers team and the GUAC core projects maintainers teams. So multiple maintainer groups for each project. I tried to kind of break it down repo wise. So governance, GUAC landing, GUAC site, although this I just archived because I don't think this is news. This kind of metadata repos. The rest kind of like fall under the current GUAC project, and then the Trustify project one would be here as well. I created separate maintainers file for each of them. So right now we have maintainers of GUAC and then maintainers of Trustify. We also have, and actually that's a good note. There's like the GUAC community maintainers, which is kind of we can revamp this a little bit, but I added the on here for now. So that's kind of like what the different projects are. I imagine if we have things that are outside the GitHub repo, we will also put it here. And just like as I just said, basically unless specified, everything will fall under the GUAC community. And then if we need to find a better home for it, we would rehome it to one of these other projects. But this is just to make sure like we don't like there isn't any orphan projects that we're not looking at.
Brandon,
GUAC
real quick, sorry, before we move on, smaller note, I think GUAC Docs probably belongs at the community level, because unless we're going to get another domain just for the Trustify docs, but I think probably what we'll want to do is have docs for everything there. The other thing is, because it's not in the governance doc, it's on the website, but we need to be thinking about what the process is like for becoming a GUAC community maintainer. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't use the word maintainer here, because it's almost more of a like
governing board
kind of or council or something like that.
Yeah.
But we should, I think it's kind of out of scope for this, even though it's also not. But we definitely want to be thinking in the direction of like, how do we remove people to the community, like the top level, because we have that well defined for each project, but not necessarily for the community level governance, because we haven't had to have that distinction before.
Yeah, that's a good point. At least within this PR, I kind of just use the grandfather maintainership process here, but I think that's something that we can discuss. Also, I agree where maybe maintainers probably isn't the best word for that. So that's a good point. Let me make a comment here. And then we can discuss the process for onboarding. Okay. Okay. I like to chat about this a bit if we do have time. And by the way, thanks Mihai for calling out the GUAC project not being in there. That's a big one. Cool. Let me just go through the core project governance, and then we can revisit the process for the GUAC community governing board / tag or whatever we're gonna call it. So what I've written here so far says that basically each project consists of GitHub repos. They should all live within the GUAC GitHub organization. The idea behind this is to have a simple way to organize it and find projects. Each project should establish its own project governance and contribution ladders. Each core project will have write and admin privileges to individual code repos. core projects are required to communicate their governance changes to GUAC community maintainers. And then these are around like licensing requirements, code of conduct requirements need to be agreed upon with the GUAC community maintainers / governing board. And then there's a note here that the scope of the repos is based on that list that we saw earlier. The one thing where I was like a little, I was trying to figure out how to word this is because I know we talked about like eventually harmonizing some of the governance between. Oh, sorry, I can't see hands, by the way. So if you have a hand up, just shout.
Yep. I can definitely see an argument for having cases where we might use a different license for a particular project, to fit an ecosystem better. But for the code of conduct, I think I don't see a value in not just blanket applying the OpenSSF code of conduct. And I'm not even sure OpenSSF would take well to us using anything but their code of conduct as our code of conduct. So we might just drop that and not have the possibility of separate codes of conduct for core projects.
Yeah, that sounds good. No, I'm guessing no objections. But if you do, please comment. Yeah, I know. Yeah, so back to what I was talking about. I know we talked about like wanting to harmonize like the way that contribution ladders and stuff like that in the future, but we're not really asserting that now. And so that's why I kind of wrote it as like each project will have its own thing, but they are required to communicate it to the community maintainers, right? Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing where it's like, yeah, we want you to have your own thing, but we want you to, to slowly move towards something that's kind of like a bit of mixed messaging, which I didn't quite like. So I tried to make it concrete to be like, yeah, you can do your own thing, just communicate. I don't know how everyone feels about it. Cool. I think that's about it. Then the rest of it was the maintenance files split that we talked about. And okay. So if not, I don't mind spending a little bit more time on like the process of the community maintainership / governing board, what we call it. I think my only main opinion on that is that I added this one, which is that at any one time there should be each core project should be represented by this one maintainer. So I guess quick poll on what we wanna like. If it's not maintainers, what do we want to call it?
So I'll just chime in the scorecard project, we have a technical steering committee, and then we have maintainers of the individual projects. Or actually it's just steering committee, not technical. That might be something to do here. And yeah, we don't have to have more than one maintainer of each individual project. Because they can be small, like the scorecard monitor, scorecard visualizer are very small projects.
Counterpoint for something we're calling a core project, I feel like that implies a slightly larger, and especially because like the GUAC core project, includes GUAC sec GUAC as well as GUAC visualizer and a couple other things. So like we don't, don't necessarily need 2 maintainers on Visualizer, but within that umbrella, I think we should, require at least 2. No, I guess the other question is, do we assume that all maintainers of GUACSec or of the GUAC core project and of the Trustify core project are on the technical steering committee? Or is it like there's at least one representative of each? Because those are separate questions, and I'm not sure which one exactly we're trying to answer right now.
Yeah, just for the scorecard example, again, I'm not saying it's the right way to do it, but we have, so yeah, like the scorecard core project has multiple repositories, like the scorecard action versus scorecard. So that's considered one thing. It has, of course, more than one maintainer. So I think that makes sense for the important stuff to have requirement to have, multiples. The visualizer and monitor probably have one maintainer, and that maintainer is not on the steering committee. So there's not any kind of like rule or logic that says, there has to be a person on from each small project on the steering committee. And the steering committee is more about, yeah, just setting the direction for the overall project and not actually doing like code reviews and things like that. So I don't know, that's a possibility. I mean, I don't think it's strictly better than what's here, but that's just it seems like it's doing fine.
Yeah, I think it's more, sort of being clear on which use case we're addressing. Are we talking about the number of maintainers that have to exist, or are we talking about who represents that core project on the steering committee? Because I could definitely see, you have to have at least 2 or maybe 3 maintainers to be a core project. But, each core project gets, has to have at least one member of the steering committee, but not necessarily all of them.
I think the
And
steering committee is more about, instead of saying, I can maybe even not saying the direction of each project because the maintainers do that, but maybe like what the overarching project includes and doesn't include is a very
Right.
important thing, right? And so that's definitely steering committee level.
Yeah. And I think we would want each core project to have some amount of representation, but not necessarily full.
Sure.
And that actually brings up something that I think was, let me switch over to the actual pull request. So right now it still has the maintainership is driven by engineering contributions to the project. I would suggest that that is not necessarily a requirement for the steering committee. I don't think we want to bring somebody who's made no engineering contribution necessarily, but at this point it is more of a community governance than a technical. And yeah, we probably don't want to call it a technical steering committee, but maybe it's like the GUAC steering committee or something. But yeah, so like, think about like people like me whose contributions have been more along the community and documentation lines with some, technical engineering stuff, but mostly not. I think we want to have room for that in this body. Whereas like I wouldn't feel comfortable asking to be a maintainer on, say, GUAC because I don't think my engineering and coding skills merit it. But I do think at this level, okay, yes, I can see a reasonable argument for nominating myself for that.
Yeah, I think you brought up a couple of good points here. One of them is like maybe I think there has to be a little bit more fleshed out in the responsibilities of this group, like this GUAC steering committee / governing board group. And also what is like you said, right? I think right now as it's worded, it doesn't necessarily say that you have to be a maintainer of wait, what is it? You don't have to be a maintainer of a core project in order to be a GUAC community maintainer / steering committee member, but and you must, like, each core project should have at least some representation in the group, just so that a big aspect of the community is it has a voice in the in the steering conversations. Yeah. Okay. I think this was good feedback. Sorry. Yeah.
Just one more thing. So, but I think actually this steering committee will be technical as well, right? So we need to define a lot of like cross points and things where we are going to. It's not just maintaining the community. It's a big part, but it's also, I think, what use case are we going to tackle? How are we going to organize everything to fit the community? So are we going to do it in the same group, or will the new group eventually come out to do that?
Does this kind of like encompass what you're talking about? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I agree. That this should be within the scope of that.
I mean, maybe it's too early to define all this. Like, let's start simple and start introducing new stuff when we actually need it, right? But let's think about it.
Yeah. I think it's necessary, right? Or at least like not making sure that there's someone that's thinking about it from a systematic point of view. Okay. So I think I will flesh out what the responsibilities of like the steering. Are we good with steering committee? I guess like on that note, I think we need to bring this up probably to the folks that are not on the call as well and vote on it. But besides steering committee, what other options do we have? Jeff, do you want to say something?
No, I'm just saying I'm good with it. I think it's fine.
Okay. I'll start the conversation offline with the rest of the folks that may have an opinion on this, and then we'll go from there. Cool. All right, thank you all for the feedback here. This was very helpful.
Brennan, you went on mute.
Sorry, Dan, I think it's you're up next.
Yes, so I was thinking about this other task of starting actually to organize meetings and start sharing things and introducing more people to the community. So my first question is, are we gonna maybe use this maintainer meeting for that, or I'm trying to see first with you guys, like what would be the appropriate meeting time and format to do that. So,
I think initially it makes sense just to use this meeting, and then If we find that there's too much to talk about, or there's stuff that's completely unrelated, that it makes sense to have separate meetings to create separate ones. But I don't, the stuff within GUAC has been relatively quiet for a while. So it's not like we're, necessarily like, at capacity in this meeting.
Cool. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I do want to add that I think, like, especially since we are trying to I think the question is like whether when we're doing these meetings, whether we want to have a particular, I think there's a time and place for these type of meetings where, like, we just get together and just talk about stuff, and then when we have meetings which are a little bit more focused on a certain problem, then we can branch out and have another meeting for that. I think as we're expanding the scope and discussions also, I do think it'll be nice to have a meeting where it is more like Europe APAC friendly, so we can get maybe once in a while, right? I think it could be helpful, especially since I think a lot of the folks on your side, some of them also in the European time zone. I don't know how late this is.
This is not too bad. So this is 5 to 6 p.m. So
Okay.
So this time, I think works for everybody, right?
Then perfect. Then we don't have to do anything too fancy.
Yeah. So okay, so let's start that again. Let's start simple and then complicate things when we must, right? So are you okay? So my first idea maybe was to like we had a couple of meetings here where we went through Trustify core, so to say, and UI and APIs, but there are a couple of more like side projects which are also quite big and important. For example, we have this what's called dependency analytics, which is like a VS Code and IntelliJ plugins that work with the. So maybe do introduction to that, the demo and the guys who are working on it, just to bring you guys more up to speed. What's there, So maybe plan something like that for the next time. I would also maybe at some point like to bring our PM, Michelle, to talk more about what's in her head about features and things like what we're hearing that will be important for us to work in the next year or so. So that, like, just getting these things, sharing what's on our plate.
I like that. I like that idea, and I feel like it could also be a nice thing where, as we post the announcement, we can be like, with the new expansion of the community, we want to start with like weekly sharing sessions, right? And then we will have a list of topics of like, here are the different aspects, each of us should do some with different perspective. And then that can be kind of like a series, and then from that series we will maintain a regular maintainer meeting, or a few branches of what may come out from that.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So if you are looking for additional topics, I think we should have some that we can add to that as well.
Cool. So then I'll try to organize something for next Monday. Well, let's keep in touch. If something else pops up, we can always delay. But just want to like I want to start rallying people on our side to like be more, start showing up and introduce themselves, and then we can start working together. Right?
Sounds good.
Perfect. That's all. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Any other topics? No, this is a good time to wrap up. Middle of the hour.
Sounds good.
Cool.
All right. Cool. Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
See ya.
See you, folks.